The sun was high over the land of Israel, its golden rays piercing through the lush hills of Gibeah, where the royal household of King Saul bustled with life. The palace corridors echoed with the laughter of a little boy, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, grandson of King Saul. Jonathan, a warrior of great renown and a man after God's heart, would often lift his son high above his head, spinning him around as the boy's laughter rang through the halls. Mephibosheth was a child of royal lineage, heir to strength, wisdom, and honor. His father was not only the crown prince, but also the dearest friend of David, the shepherd warrior anointed to be Israel's future king. Though war loomed on the horizon between Saul and David's forces, Mephibosheth knew nothing of political turmoil. In his world, he was the apple of his father's eye, a prince destined for greatness. Then the day of ruin arrived. A messenger rode into Gibeah, his face stricken with terror. He had come from Mount Gilboa, where the battle between Israel and the Philistines had reached a terrible end. The news was devastating. King Saul was dead. His sons, including Jonathan, had fallen with him. The crown was shattered, and the royal house was in chaos. In the palace, servants screamed, and nobles ran for their lives. In times of war, the fall of a king meant the fall of his entire household. Any surviving relatives were often slaughtered to prevent claimants to the throne. Mephibosheth's nurse, a woman with a mother's heart, knew what had to be done. She lifted the 5-year-old prince into her arms and fled the palace. She ran down the winding paths, through the streets, past weeping women and frightened men. But as she descended a rocky hill in haste, she stumbled. Mephibosheth slipped from her grasp. The boy landed with a sickening crack. His tiny legs twisted unnaturally beneath him, and a sharp cry of pain tore from his lips. The fall had shattered his bones. He would never walk properly again. The nurse, terrified and grief-stricken, carried the injured boy far from Gibeah, seeking refuge in a desolate place called Lo-debar, a barren land whose very name meant no pasture. Here, among the forgotten and the outcasts, Mephibosheth grew into a man. Gone were the fine robes of a prince. Gone were the halls of royalty, the training of warriors, and the pride of being Saul's grandson. He lived in obscurity, a crippled man in a world that valued strength. He was no longer a prince. He was a fugitive, an exile, a man with broken feet and a broken spirit. Years passed. David, once the shepherd boy, was now the mighty king of Israel. He had conquered Jerusalem, expanded his kingdom, and subdued his enemies. The house of Saul was a distant memory, a ghost of Israel's past. But one day, as David sat upon his throne in the city of David, a memory stirred within him. He remembered his covenant with Jonathan, the brother of his heart, the man who had once protected him from Saul's wrath. Jonathan had sworn eternal friendship with him, and David had vowed to show kindness to his descendants. With urgency, David called for Ziba, a former servant of Saul. "Is there anyone left from the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" David asked. Ziba hesitated before answering. "There is one, my lord, a son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth." David leaned forward. "Where is he?" "He lives in Lo-debar." Lo-debar, a place of desolation, a place where the forgotten hid. Mephibosheth, now a grown man, was no longer the bright-eyed prince of his childhood. He was a man who had learned to crawl when others walked, a man who knew hunger, shame, and fear. He had no expectations in life, only survival. Then came the king's summons. A chariot arrived at his dwelling, its horses kicking up dust. Soldiers stepped down and spoke the words that made his heart freeze. "King David has sent for you." Terror gripped him. The old fears resurfaced. Had David finally come to finish what others had started? To wipe out the last remnant of Saul's line? His heart pounded as he was lifted into the chariot and carried to Jerusalem, to the very throne room of the man who now held his fate. As he entered, he threw himself to the ground before King David, his crippled legs sprawled awkwardly beneath him. "I am your servant," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. David looked at him, and for a moment there was silence. Then, in a voice rich with kindness, the king spoke. "Do not be afraid, Mephibosheth. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table always." Mephibosheth trembled. It was too much, too kind. He, a crippled man from Lodabar, was being given the inheritance of kings. "What is your servant," he whispered, "that you should look upon a dead dog such as I?" David did not answer with words. Instead, he called Ziba and commanded him and his household to serve Mephibosheth. He ordered that the lands of Saul be returned to him, and that Mephibosheth dine at the king's table like one of David's own sons. For the first time in years, Mephibosheth sat not in the dust of Lodabar, but at the table of a king. From that day on, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, eating at David's table, honored among princes. Though his legs remained crippled, his dignity was restored.